Was the roof leaking? Certainly good to see everybody here this morning. Nobody got washed away, or those that did get washed away are still washed away and are not here. If you know of any situations like that we can be assistance to, then by all means let us know for sure. But it is a dangerous thing sometimes, as we've seen over in Chattanooga just in the last couple of weeks. And here too, to not be prepared and don't ever go through standing water. Of course, how many times do we hear that? And yet then some of the male variety feel as though that we can do it anyhow and we end up dying or killing our families or something, being stupid. So let's try to avoid doing things like that. Just a little bit of common sense. It's amazing how much common sense will do to preserve your life and to keep you out of problems. And if we'd simply apply it, then we'd be a whole lot better off. So we really need to change the first word in that phrase from common, because that means everybody does it. Everybody uses it. But that's not the case. We know that for sure. We just wish it was the case. And as God directs us through His Word, you've got common sense on one side, and you've got Bible sense on the other side. And if you got common sense and Bible sense, then you don't have nonsense. That's a statement made by Eddie Brinkley, and I think that pretty well is true, isn't it? If we go by the Bible and use a little bit of common sense, then we won't be going chasing rabbits into directions where we don't need to go. We're going to be looking at the introductory material right here as it relates to the apostles and the calling of the apostles. And if we have time at the end, then we'll go back and look at a little bit of this particular event in light of some accusations that have been made relative to the inspired record, relative to the calling of the apostles. So let's just, at this time, let's just read these first 15 verses here in Matthew chapter 10. Excuse me. And when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, he gave them power against unclean spirits to cast them out, and to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of diseases. Now the names of the 12 apostles were these: the first, Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the publican, James the son of Alphaeus and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as ye go, preach, saying, The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. Freely ye have received, freely give. Provide neither gold nor silver, nor brass in your purses, nor scrip for your journey, neither two coats, neither shoes, nor yet stays, for the workman is worthy of his meat. And into whatsoever city or town you shall enter, inquire who in it is worthy, and there abide till you go thence. And when you come into a house, salute it. And if the house be worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it be not worthy, let your peace return to you. And whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words, when you depart out of that city or house or city, shake off the dust of your feet. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that particular city. Now, this, of course, is not the only instance in which we find this same basic information given. We'll look at that if time permits at the end, because, like I said a few minutes ago, there's been some speculation as to the promotion of a contradiction in what the inspired record tells us. Well, we know there's no such thing as a contradiction in God's inspired word, so how do you handle it? We'll deal with that pretty soon. What is this commonly referred to as, this particular event here? The limited commission. And why is it called a limited commission? Because it's only to the household of Israel. It's only to the Jews. So it's making a contrast in what we do when we identify it as being the limited commission. We are making that in contrast to what other commission? The Great Commission. in which the Great Commission, of course, given after Jesus is resurrected from the dead, he commissions his apostles to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. No distinction as to who are be the recipients. Everybody is responsible for obeying the gospel message made possible by the death of Jesus Christ on the cross and his resurrection that gives us hope. So here's two different commissions given. Now, with this associated commission here, what is a specific thing that is mentioned that goes along with their ability to convince people that they are, in fact, spokesmen for God? Miracles. They're able to perform miracles. These miracles, of course, were not to testify to how wonderful they were, but that the message was a message from heaven. As they were going forth and preparing the way for the coming kingdom and all that, it's interesting that the same phrase is used here in the limited commission as Jesus commissions them to go and preach the kingdom of heaven is at hand, which is exactly the same thing that he began to preach when he began to preach back in Matthew chapter 3. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And that's not the first time we hear it preached, because John the Immerser went forth preaching, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So this is the same message by these three different groups of people. And that message, of course, is that the kingdom is a-coming, and the necessity of them repenting in order to be prepared for the kingdom when it does come. Now, what do we know that the kingdom has a reference to? It has reference to the church. It's talking about the kingdom of God, the church of the living God, the same church, the same kingdom that Jesus used those terms interchangeably in Matthew chapter 16. He said, I will build my church. The gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And then he turns right around and says to Peter and the rest of the apostles, and I give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So Jesus is not saying, okay, I'm going to establish the church and then the kingdom something else. No, he's talking about the one same institution. The church has reference to its being called out of the world. Ecclesia, out of, to call. Kingdom has reference to the political structure of the church. King Jesus and the rest of the universe is his subjects. And of course we have the prerogative to exercise our free moral agency to be under King Jesus, but regardless of whether we do that or not, then we're going to meet him on the day of judgment and be judged by his words. Remember, in John chapter 12, verse 48, he that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words, that's the one that judgeth him. The word that I have spoken, the same shall judge him at the last day. Somebody says, whoa, wait a minute. Well, what about the Muslim world? They're going to be judged by the word of Jesus. Well, what about the Hindu world? They're going to be judged by the words of Jesus. Anybody and everybody in the whole world. What are atheists going to be judged by? The words of Jesus. Jesus set that forth very plain, and it coincides with the statement that he made in John chapter 14, verse 10, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. He's the only way to the Father. It's not through anybody else. And while there's a whole lot of people that want to stand in that position and lead us to believe that you have to go through them and their so-called inspired writings to get to Jesus and to get to the Father, that simply is not the case. So it shouldn't surprise us then, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says, beginning at verse 21, not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. And you'll recall on that occasion, there was an argument that ensued in this hypothetical situation. People said, whoa, wait a minute. Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? Lord, Lord, have we not done many wonderful works in thy name? Have we not been capable of performing miracles in thy name? And the answer to that is, no, you hadn't. Now, he doesn't question whether they were busy or not. Had they been actively involved in maybe work in which they were trying to restore the health of individuals? Had they built hospitals? Well, okay, that's good. But how far does that go? If you build hospitals, take care of people's physical well-being, and their soul is not taken care of, then what have you ultimately done? Not really anything. It don't last past the here and now. So you have to do what the will of the Father is in order to be a disciple of Jesus. We'll see more about that as we develop in here a little bit further. So, and this is just sort of introductory and maybe grammar schoolish to an extent, but it lays out just exactly what transpires right here. Jesus came for a purpose on earth. The first 30 years or so of his life was preparing him for that purpose. Why do we not have more information about what was going on during those years? We don't need it. Simple as that. If we needed it, we'd have it. We don't hear anything happening after the Luke chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, where Jesus is pictured as increasing in favor and wisdom, in favor with God and man, increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. During those years, intervening years from 12 to 30, don't know. But he was actively involved in exerting an influence, and could we not draw the conclusion that the influence he was exerting was a good one? Was he in learning by practice how to communicate in a better way? I mean, he was the perfect Son of God. We know he was tempted at all points as we are, yet without sin, so we know he wasn't sinning during that period of time. But he was developing nonetheless, and he was around a lot of people that hopefully would be the ones through whom he would have the greatest influence. So that's a 30-year period of time. Somebody says, well, why did it take 30 years? Well, we could also ask, why didn't it take more than that? Why not 50 years? Well, it's sort of like the answer to the question in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. What does that phrase, in the fullness of time, mean? Tina's trying to sneeze. At the right time, exactly. At the right time. Whose time frame? Well, God's time frame. And see when we look at that, I say, okay, according to God's timeline, this was the opportune time to send his Son. Well, if it would have been a better time some other time, then that would have been the time that it would have been right for him to send his Son. And so you look at what transpired, and while we know that there were 3,000 obeyed the gospel on the day of Pentecost, 3,000 compared to the million that were in the city of Jerusalem at that time, that's not a very big percentage. Now, in the way that we oftentimes think, we say, well, maybe they weren't as prepared as they should have been. If Jesus just held up for about 10 years, then maybe there had been 4,000 obeyed the gospel on the day of Pentecost. But that's foolish speculation, obviously. Now, when the time was right, and there's all kind of historical data to show how this was a prime time just from a common sense standpoint. There was a common language that was spoken in all of that area. It was called Koine Greek. Now, you're talking about Hebrews here, whose native tongue, of course, is Hebrew, but they could speak in the common language of the market, which was Koine Greek, a language that is dead now, obviously. Nobody speaks that Greek. I tried to use a little Koine Greek back when I took Greek many, many years ago with Andy down here at Andy's Steakhouse. Well, he didn't know what in the world I was saying. I didn't know what he was saying either, because he speaks modern Greek. It's not the same as Koine Greek, the common language that was spoken throughout the Roman Empire at that time. So it was a common language. Would that be a great benefit if you're trying to get the message of salvation through Christ all throughout the world, if everybody has that same language? Well, sure it would. Now, it don't mean that everybody could speak that language, and thus we see the use of miraculous gifts in which individuals were given the capacity to speak in languages they'd not previously studied, so everybody could hear the gospel in their own native tongue, just as happened in Acts chapter 2, but a common language. How easy was it to move around and to locate from one section to another section of the Roman Empire? Easy. Now, they didn't have trains and planes and automobiles, obviously, but they had good roads. Some of those roads are still standing in the Roman Empire. So you could get anywhere pretty easy. You could go by ship, as Paul often did. You could go by a cart. You could go on a horse. You could walk. Now, we're not saying anything about the absence of thieves maybe going to knock you in the head in certain places and try to steal something from you, which gave rise, of course, to the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10, but there was common road. Was there relative peace at the time that God sent forth His Son, born of a woman under law? Yeah, relative peace, you know. As long as you wasn't upsetting the apple cart, as long as you wasn't trying to overthrow Rome, then they'd pretty well leave you alone. And that kept on being the problem that Jesus and His apostles, and then, of course, the Lord's church had to deal with in Jerusalem, is because they were constantly trying to overthrow the influence of the Roman government in Judea and in Jerusalem, in the promised land previously known. So,
The network of Roman roads all throughout those countries, everything was like 250,000 miles worth of roads.
250,000 roads.
They were built to last.
Yeah, absolutely. They were built to be able to transport the armies of Rome to anywhere fairly quickly. You know, something I read a number of years ago that shocked me is that the modern railroad, you know why the modern railroad is the tracks are as wide as they are? Because it goes to the pattern of the wagons that were pulled by 2 mules or 2 horses. It goes all the way back to those ruts that would be cut. So here are all the advancements that man has made all through these years, and yet there's the pattern. Goes all the way back to Roman roads and being able to go from hither to yon. Yeah. At the same time, this don't really have nothing to do with it, but we've seen the absence of people being able to use very good common sense when it comes to navigating our highways, you know, lately, because people can't speak the language. How many people have you known that tried to drive down a railroad track because the GPS said go this way? That happens a lot. They don't have enough sense to realize, hey, this is not for me, this is for a train. But my GPS, it tells me to go this way. What if it tells you to go off the cliff? You're going to go off probably. It's ridiculous. So how in the world that can get in there? I don't know. Sorry about that. So for the first 30 years, this is preparing for it. After this, of course, is the events that we're talking about today occurred after Jesus had been baptized, after He's been tempted by Satan. He's gone through that temptation all wonderfully well, and now He's beginning to begin His work here upon this earth. He chose 12 men to not only help Him, but at the same time, they're learning from Him. They're seeing all the things that He did, so that when He ascends back to the Father, then they'll be able to carry on this mission. That's all this preparation, some 3 to 3.5 years of preparation. Well, how good was that preparation? Well, that's the story, the 12. Now, here's a quotation. I want you to listen. This is not an inspired quotation, but I think it's pretty profound. These 12 men were not learned men and could not be supposed to spread their religion by art or talents. They were not men of wealth and could not bribe men to follow them. They were not men of rank and office and could not compel men to believe them. They were just such men as are always found to be the best witnesses in courts of justice. Plain men of good sense, of fair character, of great honesty, and with favorable opportunities of ascertaining facts to which they bore witness. Such men everybody believes, and especially when they are willing to lay down their lives to prove their sincerity. No witnesses were ever so well qualified to give testimony as they, and none ever gave so much evidence of their sincerity as they did. That's a pretty good synopsis, I think, of these men. Of course, that's from Albert Barnes in his commentary, and that's the publishing date, 1972. That's the volume. That's not the age in which Barnes wrote that. But that describes these men to a T. It's not because they had great speaking skills. It's not because they could convince you to do something that you didn't really want to do because they had the power of that. No. It wasn't because they looked wonderful. They could charismatic and being able to sway people because of their great pomp and circumstance. No, they couldn't do that. but they were honest, generally speaking. One of them wasn't, obviously. So let's obviously look at some of this evidence. One day, after spending many hours teaching and helping the multitudes who followed him, he told his followers, "The harvest truly is plentiful, the laborers are few. Therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." That's at the end of the chapter, right before Matthew chapter 10. And so who's going to take this tremendous responsibility on their shoulders to go into the world and preach this message? I mean, just to go into Jerusalem and then Judea and then Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the, who's going to do that? Well, it's got to fall on the shoulders of somebody. And of course, it's going to fall on these guys' shoulders. He went up into the mountain that very night, and I'm pretty well sure that when he was praying all night, one of the things he was praying about was this coming decision to choose these men to serve as apostles. Now, here's a distinction that we need to be aware of. Of course, most of the time we are. Jesus knew that from many followers, and the followers of Jesus are called disciples, he would need to choose a few good men who would be great preachers and leaders of the church later. So there's a difference between a disciple and an apostle. And we say it like this. A disciple is someone who wants to learn from a teacher, somebody that's following a master teacher. Of course, here we have the perfect teacher, the master teacher, the best teacher there ever was in Jesus. And so a follower of Jesus, by definition, is a disciple of Jesus. Now, there are other qualifications to be a disciple of Jesus, too, that we see throughout his lifetime. If a person is not willing to follow Jesus before he follows his family, then he ain't a disciple of Jesus. Okay? If a man's not willing to lay himself aside and follow Jesus, then he ain't fit to be a disciple of Jesus. If a man's more concerned with his reputation than following Jesus, then he ain't fit to be a disciple of Jesus. He might call himself a disciple, but that don't make you a disciple. And that's one of the reasons why we'll use the example in Acts chapter 11, verse 26, that the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. So here are genuine followers of Jesus, not perfect, but that's what they're all about. That's the primary goal of their life, is following Jesus, doing the Lord's bidding. Well, what do you call people like that? Well, they're Christians. They become disciples, they obey the gospel, they're Christians now, and their sincere desire is to follow Jesus because he is, as we already stated earlier in this study, he's already established the fact that he's the only way to the Father. So why would anybody follow anything else other than Jesus? We're all disciples. We're all disciples.
We're following Jesus and believe, etc.
So,
but all disciples are not apostles.
All disciples are not apostles. So a man that was chosen by Jesus to be a special preacher, sharing the good news about the Savior with others, literally the word apostle means one sent. Okay? Now, when you're using that term apostle, then that simply means one sent. But there is more than, there's a more expansive definition of that term when you're talking about the specific individuals that we read the names of just a few minutes ago. All the apostles were at one time disciples of Jesus, but not all disciples are apostles. Okay? Somebody says, well, that's a distinction that doesn't matter. It does matter. It does matter. One of the times very soon in Acts chapter 1, you see that there are all these disciples that are assembled together after Jesus has been crucified. The apostles have been told by Jesus to tarry in the city of Jerusalem till they be endued with power from on high. The promise of what's going to come about when the power comes is not given to all the disciples. It's given to the apostles. The apostles are the one that receive power. The 120 don't receive the power. It's the apostles that do. They are the ones that stand up and speak in languages that they'd not previously studied. It's not the 120. Now, they're disciples, but they're not apostles. And thus, that's a distinction that really does matter. The original 12, of course, were mentioned, and then later we got Paul, and later we got Matthias as well. We'll see more about that here in a minute. And since we've looked at the distinctions that exist there between disciples and apostles, while we're all, as Ricky said, disciples, there are no such thing as apostles today. They don't meet the criteria for what an apostle is. The means whereby one becomes an apostle does no longer exist. And the need for apostles no longer exists. What was the purpose of the miraculous in the first century anyhow? To confirm the word. To confirm the word. It wasn't to draw attention to oneself as being Superman. It was to give credence to the message that the individual spoke, that it was in fact from God. And it had that effect as well. Now, what's crazy and almost impossible to explain is that while people saw these miraculous events and would even admit that these were miraculous things being happening, they still, because of their position, because of their prestige in the Jewish religion, they refused to acknowledge that Jesus Christ was in fact the Son of God. They would do such things as, we cannot but admit that a notable miracle has been performed. Therefore, let's bring these fellas in here and beat them and tell them to shut up talking about Jesus. Now, is that common sense? No, that's nonsense. You've admitted a notable miracle was performed, and yet you're not going to give credence to the guys who are talking about Jesus and his crucifixion on the cross and the salvation that's available through his blood? You'd rather just shut up the persons who are talking about that? That don't make good sense at all. But yet that was the mentality of people. And it shouldn't surprise us. Remember that Abraham told the rich man, Luke chapter 16, if your brothers don't pay no attention to Moses and the prophets, they wouldn't listen to anybody that came from the dead. And that's the case. How far were the children of Israel into the wilderness before they were encouraging Aaron to build a golden calf? They just got through seeing 10 plagues come up on the Egyptians. They just marched across the Red Sea on dry ground. And they got over there and got a little bit hungry. They got to feeling sorry for themselves. We didn't have this problem when we was back there in Egypt. Oh, yeah, we was having to work 7 days a week, 14 hours a day. But it was a whole lot easier back there. And so they rebelled against God, even though they knew that what was happening was in accordance with God's will. Special messengers. All right, here we go. Now here's sort of a little quiz, and when you see the question, answer it, and it should come up next. I hope this works. 12 things to remember about the apostles. One of these apostles carried the money bag. He was the treasurer, but he also betrayed Jesus. Who would that be? That was Judas. One guy was chosen to take Judas' place. What was his name? His name was Matthias. One guy was also a publican, a tax collector. What was his name? His name was Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector. 2 men were mending their nets when Jesus called them to be disciples. Who was that man? James and John. I mean, it had to be one of the group, one of the 2 men. James and John were. 2 went to Jesus' tomb when the women told the apostles that Jesus had risen from the dead. Peter and John. 3 slept in the garden while Jesus was praying. Peter, James, and John. We call them the inner 3, the circle that seemed to be closer to Jesus than the others. It seems as though they're in close proximity to him when the others are not. Whether that's a coincidence or what, but it just seems as though they're closer to Jesus in many respects. Who denied Jesus 3 times? Peter did. That's sort of out of place there. 4 of the apostles' names start with a J. James, John, James, son of Alphaeus, and Judas Iscariot. Okay? 4 were brothers. Peter and Andrew and James and John. 5 had 5 letters in their name. James comes up all the time, doesn't he? Peter, Judas, Simon, and James. Now, we're going to have a test on this, so remember all these answers, right? 5 letters in their name. 6 had more than one name. Now, here's where some of the confusion and some of the accusations of contradictions are found in the atheists and infidels of the day. Here they are. Matthew's other name was Levi. Peter was also referred to as Simon, Simon Peter, and he was also referred to as Cephas, which means rock. Thaddeus was another name for Judas, not Judas Iscariot. Bartholomew, another name, Nathaniel. Thomas was Didymus, and Didymus means what? A twin. So evidently, Thomas had a twin. James, the son of Alphaeus, was also referred to as James the Less. So there's, and you can see how if somebody was trying to nitpick with the scripture, then when here's a reference to a group of the apostles and one name is ascribed to them in one passage and another name ascribed in another, contradiction, contradiction. No, it's not a contradiction. It's they had different names. Who were the six who told Peter, we're going to go fishing with you after Jesus had died? Well, that's pretty hard. Thomas, Nathaniel, James, John, and two unnamed disciples. Okay? Now that's speculation as to say that those are two apostles, but it's speculation. We'll admit that for sure. 7 went fishing in 2 boats after Jesus died. Thomas, Nathaniel, James, John, Peter, and 2 other disciples. 8 waited outside the garden while Jesus was praying. Now, if you know the third one, Peter, James, and John, so everybody's not Peter, James, and John, and not Judas, then you know that's who they are. Okay. Of course, we know that Judas went to betray him, Peter and James and John were there, so that means there's got to be 8. So there's a math problem. 9 waited outside the house of Jairus with Peter, James, and John while they went inside with Jesus. And that would be everybody but those 3, obviously. 10 met with Jesus in the upper room after his resurrection. Now, who wouldn't have been in that number? Judas wasn't for sure, but who else? Thomas wasn't there. Thomas was missing on that first Sunday night service, and he did not have the opportunity to see the Lord for sure. 11 saw Jesus ascend into heaven. That would have been everybody but Judas. And 12 ate the Last Supper. 12 stood before the crowd at Pentecost and preached the good news about Jesus. Now, the distinction between the 12 that stood on the day of Pentecost would have been a replacement of Judas, who's dead, with Matthias. And so there's the distinction. So if sometimes, we'll have tests and people say, don't sing it, don't sing the song, don't sing the song. So here's a way you don't have to sing the Apostles' song, but it's a whole lot easier to sing the Apostles' song than it is to remember all this. I know that. But there is a way that you can go through. I found this, there was a woman that wrote it, but I didn't even write it down as to who it was. But anyhow, she first came up with this. And I find it beneficial. One time years ago, it was either Eddie Kraft or Wesley Simon one that talked about 7 sayings of the cross, and it was based on 7 things that transpired around the cross. 7 things associated with the cross, which is something that I sometimes think about when we're eating the Lord's Supper. The 7s. Of course, the last one is the 7 sayings of the cross, obviously. But the 6th, I'll have to start at the first. The first, of course, is Jesus is the one and only Son of God. 2 is that Jesus was 100% human and 100% divine all at the same time. I explain that. It's impossible. 3, of course, has reference to the crosses. There were 3 crosses. 4, they quartered the clothing of Jesus out and and cast lots over getting his clothes. 5 was the wounds that he received. 6 is the hours that he hung on the cross, and then the 7 sayings of the cross. The last in being, it is finished. And of course, behold thy son, behold thy mother, behold thy thirst. All of those different 7 sayings of the cross is a pretty good exercise to keep your mind in the right direction. After Judas died, of course, the apostles met to choose who was going to take his place. And who made the decision as to who was going to take his place? God did. God did. Somebody needed to replace him, and Matthias was that man for sure. He was one of the 12 who stood with Peter on the day of Pentecost and preached the gospel. We know that for being the case, but nothing else is really known about him. The qualifications for an apostle are given in Acts chapter 1, verse 21 and 22. You had to see the resurrected Christ, and you had to be with the apostles from the beginning after John's baptism of Jesus. So those are the two qualifications. Did the Lord, did Paul meet those qualifications? He did. He did. How did he see the Lord? On the road to Damascus. He was an eyewitness of Jesus. And then, of course, later Paul was chosen. He's referred to as a special messenger. And he saw the Lord on the road to Damascus. That's it on that. Now, here what I was telling you about, and I just won't hand these out, we'll just talk about it. But apologetics approach to the different callings of the apostles. For example, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the same calling of Peter, Andrew, James, John, all that. Different names that are used in those records, but they're all there. But at the same time, when you look at Matthew and Mark, it's a reference to the calling of these apostles immediately following the temptation of Jesus, just as we mentioned a few minutes ago, and the beginning of his public ministry. Whereas, when it comes to the calling that's recorded in the book of Luke, in Luke chapter 5, while it seems to be the identical same calling, it's actually after those events have taken place. I'll just hand this out so you can look at it, so I won't have to just... So while those are being handed out, if you want to turn to Luke chapter 4, Luke chapter 4, beginning at verse 31. And while we see, of course, the temptation of Jesus there in Luke chapter 4, earlier part, then there are a bunch of other events that take place here, according to Luke's account, that are not included in Matthew and Mark's account of all things. And so some have gone to the point of speculating as to why that is the case. In Luke chapter, let's just begin looking here at Luke chapter 4, beginning at verse 31. He came down to Capernaum, city of Galilee, and taught them on the Sabbath day, and they were all astonished at what he was doing, because he was, of course, speaking as a person that had power in the words that he spoke. And then he talks about this, here was in the synagogue a man who had an unclean spirit, crying out with a loud voice, saying, "Let us alone, Jesus of Nazareth, are you come to destroy us?" And of course, here was an indication that this demon knew who Jesus was, and Jesus rebuked him. Now see, those events are not included. Those are events that took place after Jesus called the apostles in Matthew and Mark's account. So how do you explain that to be the case? Well, it's really pretty simple in that, was Jesus limited to calling the apostles in one time? No. How many times did Jesus clear the temple out when they were money changers in there? Well, he did it once at the beginning of his public ministry and once at the end. So he did it twice. So it's not a contradiction there. It's two different times. Could it be the case that the calling of the apostles could have occurred at two different... Well, how about this? In John chapter 1, we have the first calling of Peter, Andrew, James, and John. So that'd be 3. But we know that's no problem. If you've got Jesus verbalizing the words, okay, let go of your fishing business and come follow me and make fishers of men, would it be out of the ordinary for that to transpire at multiple times? Do we think, and maybe we had thought this, that once they were called away from their fishing business, they never went back to doing any of that again. But that's a speculation on our part, isn't it? Could they not have slipped back from time to time and done a little bit of fishing? Or is it required that they completely abandon their means of livelihood? Or could it be possible that there are two different events here that are covered in a different way, one synonymously by Matthew and Mark, and then Luke covering a different time entirely? Well, that's a possibility, obviously so. So this is simply an explanation as to whenever you see a so-called discrepancy, instead of jumping to the conclusion, uh-oh, here's a problem, we need to just avoid talking about that, realize there is a reasonable explanation for what appears to be a discrepancy. There can't be a discrepancy in God's Word. There could be a misunderstanding that's associated with our thinking. So many times the real problems that people have with what's said is that they limit the whole event to what's written in one account. Where we've used the example many times, if there was a head-on collision right down here in front of the Tom Mosley service station, which is no longer there, what's that called? Chamber of Commerce. If there was a head-on collision right there and you had four people standing on four different corners of the road there, would they record the exact same thing what they saw? No way, no way. And of course, once they started putting it on their phone, then there's 75 different explanations as to what happened, you know. And it's spread all over Dunlap. It's on YouTube. People's watching it on Facebook. Oh no. And there's all types of more information that can be derived from all those different examples. Could there be some false information? Well, here's the distinction between what we see when we're retelling an event and when God is recording an event through his inspired penman. There are no mistakes. There are no discrepancies. There's no misidentifying people. That doesn't happen. When we read the individuals here that went fishing with Peter after the resurrection, when it says, and two other disciples. Well, if it was necessary for us to know what their names were, then we'd had that. But it doesn't really matter. It was just two other disciples. Was it two other apostles? Could have been. But as we've already noted, you know, all the apostles were disciples, but not all disciples were apostles. So that's the distinction. And when you put the whole record together, then and only then do you have all the information. And we put all this information together, then we draw the conclusion there is no discrepancy. There was either more information provided by Luke that fills in some of the blanks that's available to be filled in Matthew and Mark, or this is a reference to two different times that the apostles were called to be apostles. I mean, did a bunch of pomp and circumstance have to associate itself with that, you know? Was there a big auditorium in which here these 12 apostles get up and walk across the stage and Jesus says, I'm now calling you to be an apostle? Or was it just a common event? Here you're being commissioned to let go of what you're doing right here and preach the gospel and be a follower of me. And to give so much to it that you end up dying because you're willing to be an apostle, which is what happened to all the apostles, except John maybe. But I'm of the persuasion that John as well lost his life for being a Christian too. Was that the bell? What timing? If you have any questions or any comments on this, then let us know and we'll deal with it as much as necessary to try to clear up any type of misunderstanding. And the references down at the bottom as well will give you a whole lot more information to substantiate what's said in this article too. And that woman's name is Sarah Ricci. She may be kin to Janice. Thank you much.